Chapter 20. And a Happy New Year. Notes. Many thanks for your reviews and kudos. I hope you like the new Chapter D. Chapter text. Chapter 20. And a Happy New Year. Khan had quickly decided that from all the cities he knew on Sereno, a grand total of 2, Fiora was his favorite. It was a lot smaller than Corania, a lot quieter too, and a lot warmer. The town was located in the tropical part of the planet, on the southern shore of the Bolsalian Sea, and even during the local winter, the temperature never went colder than shirt-only weather. Most of the town was built near the shore, where black sand led to rolling waves of turquoise water, forming a semicircle going into the jungle. The holiday house Anya's family had there was on the outskirts of the town, on a little cliff overlooking the sea, where a stair had been carved for easy access to a discreet ship hangar, and a secretive cove hidden from the coast. It was smaller than he had expected, made of pure white stone with a turquoise dome roof and intricate levels, surrounded by fragrant flowers and fruit trees. It gave off a carefree vibe he hadn't been expecting after the austerity of the citadel. The trip itself, on a private boat that used an interesting solar technology to navigate the sea, had been breathtaking, gorgeous landscapes going slowly from snowy and mountainous to grassy and flatter, before turning into a tropical wonderland. They had to do some shopping when they arrived, neither of them having planned summery outfits. He was quite sure this was Anya's design. She had tons of clothes, and had purposely not packed anything appropriate. He supposed it was an excuse to have a reason to drag him into stores, and it hadn't been unpleasant to let her pick some garments for him, and to make flattering comments when she got out of the fitting room. It felt domestic, normal, perhaps even boring, but it was time they could spend together doing something else than plotting and training, and it gave it some flair. It got a bit overwhelming when Anya was recognized, but that was maybe the most inconvenient thing that happened on their weekend there so far, which said a lot about it, really. He sat straighter when he saw that Anya was readying herself, and the force around him moved a tad faster, anticipating what was to come. They were in the garden, looking at some very dead bougainvillea, and she was going to try and reverse time for the plant. She inhaled, and he recognized the feeling he got when she used the gift on him when they went back. All of the hair on his body rose, his skin crawling at the unnatural sensation in the air, as the force's usual whispers suddenly took a more ancient and dangerous tone. Anya raised her hand, fingers steady, and it felt like something was whizzing in the distance as the bougainvillea came alive, all petals young and vibrant pink again, leaves of brilliant green. She lowered her palm and took a deep breath as the feeling receded calmly. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Good, for now. It's always easier this way," she replied, her voice slightly shaky. "Because you're using the light." She looked a bit unsure and hummed noncommittally. "I don't know if it can be called light, even when you're storing, but yes. The call is harder to ignore the other way." Khan knew it was morbid curiosity, but after hearing her speak about the power, he wanted to see for himself how it felt. Would it be worse than what she had just done for him to feel, or just for her to perform? Still, if she wasn't up for it, he didn't want to pressure her into it. "Do you want to try?" "Yes." She inhaled, gathering the power inside her, tainting the force with it again, and raised her palm towards the plant. Something that sounded like nails on durasteel resonated in his skull, contorting his face in discomfort, his teeth strangely aching in his mouth as the bougainvillea decayed rapidly. The petals and leaves once again turning to a dull brown-gray color, as every ounce of life was sucked out of them. He stared at the plant for a moment, fascinated, and thanked all ancient Sith that Palpatine hadn't known or wasn't interested in this part of her abilities. There was sheer power behind the simple appearance of the act, one that twisted his gut with unease and reeked, swirling around them, seeking more. Anya had been right to be wary of this side of her powers. It upset the Force, and felt a lot more wrong than even Sith lightning, agitating the very fabric of the universe, and it was just a plant. She had spoken of sacrifices before, telling him the power wasn't free, and that every action on sentience or main events shaping the future required a hefty price. She had told him of the seizures she had experienced after Virajansi, the payback she had to endure for using it on her kidnappers. Just how much had she given up to bring them back in time and restore his body? "Still good?" he found himself asking instead. They were on holiday in Anya's house, and she had just done something that terrified her. It wasn't the right time to discuss this. "Yes, still good. It's easier when you're with me." He nodded, approving. His own control when playing with fire was a lot better when Anya was near him. He figured it was either because of their bond, or because her presence stirred him naturally towards more positive feelings. Both, probably. It was quite satisfying to know it was reciprocated. She gathered the energy once more, breathing some life in the plant once again, then wiped her forehead, panting. "Do you want to go down to the cove?" Khan frowned, a tad concerned for her. She seemed tired. "If you were up for it." Anya smiled, panting lightly. "I am, let's have dinner there." They went back to the house, Anya a bit pale but otherwise unharmed. She had experimented a bit more with her powers since they arrived, enjoying the place's discretion to try her hand at some exercises without Dooku breathing down her neck. Khan, too, had been making drastic progress in his fire manipulation. It was still mediocre, and he still got very close both to the dark side and to ugly panic attacks when things got a bit too heated, but the proximity of the sea helped a lot to calm his fears and allow him to go all out. He grabbed some fruits from the basket that was placed on the kitchen table and saw that Anya had taken the cheese and bread. Smiling silently at the incongruity of it all, he took 2 glasses and a bottle of light wine and followed her down the stairs to his favorite place of all. If anyone from the Empire had seen him right now, they would have gotten checked in a medbay for potential hallucinations, because there was no way in hell that Lord Vader, the Emperor's mighty attack dog, was having a picnic by the beach. When they arrived, she felt normal again, her Force presence no longer agitated by unnatural turmoil, and they quickly set up the large cupboard that Anya had brought down the previous evening and sat down, putting the food in the middle of them. She then poured them wine and grabbed some local grapes, watching him get ready to try pyrokinesis again. Khan faced the sea, where the sun was beginning to set, and pulled deep, his breath connecting him with the higher power that was always with him. He reached deeper, darker too, ignoring the enticing pleas of the dark to embrace both sides as equally as he could, his mind quiet, his body steady. He exhaled and slowly an orb of fire gathered in front of him, glowing bright against the dimming lights of the day. Pushing against himself, keeping his mind as calm as he could, he touched it, letting the fire caress his skin without burning it. It slithered between his fingers, wrapped itself around his wrist, always under control. Then, as he liked to practice, he threw a rock with his other hand, and set the fire after it in a long stream of flames. The rock exploded. Good. Confident, he raised both hands towards the sea, feeling his body heat up from the proximity of the fire, and threw tongues of flames to the water, testing how far he could push before the fire stopped being in his control. Quite far, it turned out. When he finally stopped, his eyes were goldish, but he hadn't lost control and just felt a bit tired. Anya, beside him, was sipping some wine while looking at his pyromaniac display, and congratulated him when he was done. "It's the first time you got that far, that was amazing. It's still quite far from being combat ready though, I need too much focus to be able to use it, while I'm distracted by anything else," he replied, frustrated by his meager progress. She smiled, comforting and fond. "It will come, we still have some time, remember?" "I do." He bottled his impatience, nearly hearing Obi-Wan's voice chastising him at the back of his mind, and reached for the wine, savoring for a moment the light peachy taste it had. The sun was nearly set now, casting purple rays across the calm sea, his previous burning experiment making its surface fog, diffusing the light beautifully. Not for the first time since he met with Anya on Alaysia's spaceport, he wondered what he had done to deserve to feel this satisfied with life, and not for the first time he concluded he should just relax and enjoy, because there didn't seem to be any valid reason. Anya put music on her datapad, something light that meshed well with the mood, and they ate lazily, half sprawled on the cover as a warm breeze kept the air soft, carrying the salty scent of the sea to their noses. A couple of minutes after they had finished their light meal, as they were watching the moon's rise, a song started, and Anya turned to him with a witty smile. "Can I have this dance, Mr. Vader?" He rolled his eyes, recognizing the typical rhythm of the Serenian tango, the second dance she had taught him during the dancing interludes he had consented to after Life Day. It was a lot more naughty than the coruscanti waltz, and included carrying her rather frequently, but it was less choreographed, and he liked it a bit better. He knew she knew that too. They rose, she put the music a bit louder, and he took her hand as his arm went to find her waist. They twirled for a moment, laughing as they tripped on the black sand, and slowly the tango became even naughtier, the force swirling around them, incandescent, sparkling with embers of passion, amusement, and love. The song ended, leaving him breathless and eager, observing her flushed face, her green eyes shining under the moonlight. When he kissed her, her lips tasted like sea salt and peachy wine, and her skin burned against his in a way that had nothing to do with his previous endeavors. They collapsed on the cover, still locked in a fierce embrace, and he felt her hands on his back, tracing his muscles with a light touch that made his skin shiver. Smiling against her lips, he moved his own hands against her hips, pulling her closer as desire pulled in his abdomen, setting his entire body on the most pleasant fire he had ever known. It was also one of the positive points about Fiora. With Dooku relatively far, there were way fewer barriers stopping them from removing their clothes whenever they wanted to experiment with another type of skill. This time felt especially satisfying, with soft music in the background blending with the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, and the dim light of the moons, only witnesses of their passion, shining dully on their skins. The sand was annoying, as always, but Sereno had pretty, fine, and warm sand that never burned or gritted his skin like Tatooine's one did, so it wasn't that much of a negative point. He would have stayed there for hours, discovering her over and over again, perfectly satisfied with his New Year's Eve, but Anya wanted to do some kind of ritual, and according to her, it was particularly important they did it at midnight. And so half an hour before midnight they got their clothes back on and climbed the stairs back to the house, as he bid a silent farewell to the cove that he would probably not see again for a while, since they were leaving the next day. He dropped the remains of their dinner in the kitchen and followed her in the garden again, quite intrigued with her proceedings, now that he had overcome his initial reticence. She was drawing multiple circles on the grass with what he identified as black chalk, one at the center of the design, then 6 around that one, then 6 more connected to them, forming an intriguing cross with 6 branches. She then put the chalk down and grabbed another bag before starting drawing again, in white this time. Lines going from the center of each circle to every other circle, the pattern soon beginning to look like an intricate 6-branches star, including a hexagonal shape surrounding the central circle. Anya picked up yet another bag, with stones this time, and put one at each outer circle, their names and meaning eluding him. Smiling, she asked him to put a black candle in each inner circle, and to light them up while she finished. She went back to the kitchen for a moment and returned with 6 bowls on a platter. She put them in the central circle just as he finished with the candles, on the very center of it, turned off the house's lights, and gestured for him to sit down. The pattern is a version of the flower of life. Since the ritual is meant to honor the year past and celebrate the year to come, it is the one that makes the most sense. It symbolizes the cycle of creation, she said as she sat next to him. The stones. They represent the 4 seasons. Between winter and spring you have a demantoid for any one, and between summer and fall an onyx for a des. The candles are engraved with related inscriptions, and the bowls each contain an offering for them. Milk, honey, and flowers for her, grain, wine, and blood for him. If anyone else had tried to explain something similar, he would have probably not believed any of it, but he had already witnessed some of Anya's rituals, and whatever deity she messed with had at least an impact on the Force, what gave the entire thing a lot more legitimacy. Will they take it? We'll see, but the offering is more meaningful than its reception, she explained gently, the concept echoing his mother's teachings about helping others and being a kind person in a cruel galaxy. Anya expected nothing in return, her offering had no strings attached, it was freely given to honor her gods. A kind gesture to celebrate the new year, if a bit of an intense one. Giving back a form of sacrifice, I suppose. Exactly. If you just want to watch it is okay. Otherwise, I'll repeat each prayer twice. He nodded and shivered lightly as she started chanting in the strange tongue she used for the rituals, the witchy one. The sensation from before was back, but instead of feeling unnatural, it just felt ancient and ominous. Fighting against his tight throat, he repeated after her, the words weird against his lips, the meaning obvious even if he didn't understand a single syllable. The warm wind seemed to pick up, and the moons focused their light on the circle, making the stones glint wildly against the darkness of the night. The candles wavered, the flames growing bigger as the wax dripped down the grass, erasing the inscriptions. The Force swelled, nearly visible, as thick as a liquid, but as light as smoke, surrounding them, painting his lungs and coating his throat, caressing his skin and drinking his very essence. It still felt ancient and dangerous, but there was now an undertone of elation, as if the higher power was joyful to see its children celebrated, rejoicing at their offerings, drinking in their very words with unabashed pleasure. They repeated the chant 13 times, once for every circle, and when they closed their mouths, the offerings were gone, and he felt strangely depleted. Their prayers had been heard. Anya kissed him, breaking the spell, and her hands felt cold and soothing on his skin. Happy New Year, Khan. Happy New Year, Anya, he whispered back. I'm telling you something is wrong. A voice shouted angrily. Mindful of your feelings, you should be. As told, meditate on this, I will, Yoda replied sternly, his voice muffled by the wool. The GD order is going to need more than meditation, Master. There was some shuffling noise, and Master Diaz stormed out of Yoda's favorite meditation chamber, robes billowing behind him, his dark circles so pronounced they made his eyes glow unnaturally. He looked unhinged and furious. He stared at Qui-Gon for a few seconds, his lips parting to form a word, then renounced and shut his mouth, nodding his way as he passed him. Qui-Gon turned around, hand raised to stop him, but something ugly churned in the Force and held him back. The higher power was agitated, dark, lashing violently against his inner peace. There was a sense of wrongness, of urgency. Suddenly, he had the impression that something terrible was going to happen. Yoda got out shortly after, his ears hanging low on his head, looking old and sad, and sighed when he saw Qui-Gon. The genie had been meaning to speak to him about the dark presence on Coruscant, trying to sway his decision to let it go, to convince him to investigate the matter despite his lack of concrete evidence, but every argument he had thought of crumbled when he met the wise, ancient eyes of his Grand Master. Walk with me, will you? He said, releasing hurt and regret in the Force like tiny fumes of negative emotions. Seeing Master Yoda, this distress was a rare event, and the part of Qui-Gon Jinn that would forever be an initiate, filled with worry seeing the pillar of the temple looking so frail. I hadn't seen Master Diaz in months, he started with, walking slow to accommodate the other's pace. Yoda grunted noncommittally. Troubled, he is. Plagued by his visions. His stick clicked harder on the flooring when he stopped. A great gift from the Force, it is, but a curse as well. Terrible, it can be, to base your reality on possible futures. Qui-Gon stiffened, recognizing the dismissal in his tone for what it was, and bowed lightly. May the Force be with you, Master Yoda. And with you. His jaw clenched, watching the Master enter the turbolift, and the horrid feeling that had settled in his gut when he had seen Cypher Dyas burned, pushing him on a new path. Quickly, he retraced the other GD steps through the hulls, following the hollow echo of his turmoil to the hangars, intent on catching him before he left Coruscant again. He was curious to hear what the man had wanted to tell him, curious also to see how it all meshed with what Qui-Gon knew. Cypher Dyas had a key, he could feel it, a key to the strange events that were taking place on Coruscant, a key to that darkness that slowly seemed to mute the Force's voice. When he arrived, however, his T6 shuttle was already gone. He was too late. Anya looked down at her reflection and pinched her lips. They had traveled back to the Citadel the previous day, enjoying the few hours of complete privacy they had left as much as they could, and tomorrow they would train with Dooku again for the last time. He had been absent that morning but had confirmed at lunch that he was interested in a last session before they all packed and went home. Khan was in their joined living room, doing whatever he was doing on his datapad, some sort of advanced coding she understood little about apart from the very basics. It was supposed to become a basic artificial intelligence at some point, and it was a technical challenge for him to build it from the ground up. If it led nowhere, he would drop it. If he succeeded, he wanted to have it play the role of an assistant of a sort, helping him with tedious tasks he didn't want to do himself and handling simple protocols. Apparently, he had started coding more and more for his freelance projects, and he saw no reason for the skills not to serve him as well. She suspected he had planted something in at least some of the technology he worked on, but he hadn't been willing to share anything in case it didn't work out the way he wanted it to, and she figured it would be useless to pry. Anya had been working herself, handling holomails and urgent calls and planning meetings for the coming weeks, but the glaring lack of contact from the Chancellor's office had pissed her off, and she didn't want to sour the pleasant mood, so she had retreated to her refresher for a comforting bath. Alarin was ignoring her deliberately, either offended by the communication she had sent him on her way to Sereno, or because of whatever stupid narrative he had built around it. She would have to mend things when she would be back on Coruscant, and the thought of having to chase him down when she knew she was in the right was dreadful. Unfortunately, her retreat hadn't worked quite as well as she had hoped, and she had shifted her attention from the Chancellor to other, more intimate matters. She swallowed harshly, glaring at her naked form. During her teenage years she had picked at the smallest flaw of her body, thinking she was too tall, her hair too white, her face too sharp, her shape too muscular. She hadn't liked how different she had looked compared to most Serenians, how different she had looked compared to her mother and uncle. She had resented her father for her foreign appearance. Arcanians modified their genes quite heavily, and his line apparently had the arrogance to make them dominant over most others, and it showed. Growing older and losing her attractiveness to torture and deprivation before getting her younger body back, it quelled this existential crisis quite a bit, but it still felt weird, even now, to look at her youthful face and scar-free skin, and realize it was her. Sometimes when she got dressed and put on makeup and did her hair, she had the feeling she was playing doll. The body she inhabited a facade that had little to do with who she was on the inside. She poked at her left breast, watching her manicured finger move the flesh, and wondered what Khan found attractive about her. He seemed to enjoy the intimacy, and their dancing sessions often seemed to lead to it, which in theory meant their bodies liked to interact with each other. But if she could easily say she was attracted to his mind, body, and soul, she couldn't see what he saw in her. Sighing, she stopped and removed Khan's necklace from her neck, putting it on the counter of the sink. Personally, she didn't find herself fascinating. No, that wasn't true, was it? She knew she was good-looking, she just felt vaguely insecure because she was good-looking in a way that wasn't even remotely similar to his previous wife. The only thing they shared was skin color, even though Pad was a tad darker than her, and gender. She was tall where the other was petite, blonde against brunette, her face was all angles where Pad's was rounder. They had so little in common it was almost amusing. What did he like about her body? What did he like about her? Anya huffed, regretting the golden times when she was just angry at Chancellor Valoran, and left the mirror to enter the now filled tub, the object of her turmoil disappearing in deliciously warm water. She hadn't thought the relationship thing was going to bring so many questions and awkward talks. There was much more to it in the end than just kissing whenever they felt like it, contrary to what they had discussed after Sojourn. There was still a lot of kissing involved, of course, but she was starting to see it wasn't the solution to everything, and talking to him could get tricky quite fast. He was trying, she could tell, but some topics were just sensitive. Navigating the space Padme had occupied once was not particularly comfortable for her, and creating her own was going to require much more than a few days of fun together. There was this underlying sense of things moving a bit fast for them to regain their footing properly. Being attached at the hip for 2 full weeks hadn't helped, but she felt if she brought it up he would just get defensive, and it wasn't her goal. It had been magical overall, and she didn't regret any second of her holidays, but she was a bit worried about his mental state. He seemed to feel just as guilty as he was happy. She could sense it sometimes, the waves of self-hatred he emitted tasting like sulfur in the Force, and trying to make him feel better, usually made him feel worse. She wondered if he already felt the whiplash, or if it would hit him later, and she felt quite concerned about what he would do then. Would you want to break up? Can I come in? She heard him ask through the door. Go ahead, she replied, a tad confused. They had sex not too long ago, so she was quite sure it wasn't that, and he had seemed quite content to be left alone with his datapad earlier. Why would he want to interrupt her self-conscious me time? He entered the room, without his datapad, and leaned against the sink with a curious look on his face, purposely not looking below her neck. Always the gentleman. Are you okay? Oh? She had been projecting, hadn't she? If not her thoughts, then at least their uncharitable taint. She nodded. Valorum is snubbing me, I think. Since, for once, I truly have his best interest in mind, it rattled. He narrowed his eyes. And? I don't want to talk about it, she replied sternly. Khan sighed, looking a lot less angry and a lot sadder at her curt retort than she had planned. It made her feel worse, and she was starting to regret allowing him to enter the room. She just wanted to be a bit moody in peace, enjoy her bath and go back to him, when her mind wouldn't be stuck on gloomy thoughts. She didn't want to hurt him, and she could see that she already had. What did he even like about her? Can I sit with you then? He asked hesitantly. She wanted to tell him to criff off and leave her alone, but that would hurt him even more when he was trying to make an effort, and she had been raised to dominate her moods and stay pleasant in all situations. She nodded. If you want to. He left his position against the counter to step forward and sat on the large edge of the tub, pretending to look at the large window showing the snow-covered gardens, when she could feel his attention on her. His presence unnerved her, making her skin shiver uneasily despite the warm water. It was unusual, she had never in the past thought about him as unnerving, apart perhaps on Corbin, and there had been a very valid reason for it. Why now? Anya tried to forget his presence and look inward, focusing on the tangle of unpleasant emotions that pulsated in her chest. Doubt, insecurity, frustration, and a vague sense of things being too much. Having him with her all the time had been intense. They had gone from being hesitantly involved with each other to announcing to the entire galaxy that they were together. They had made love, they had shared meals, beds, thoughts, they had spent an enchanting weekend, what still seemed to be a dream on Fiora, and all of this in a short span of time. It gave her vertigo just to think back on it, and her analytical mind needed time to process the things she had done instinctively. She had been projecting on him at least partially earlier, worrying about his mental state when she should have been worried about hers. Carefully, she examined each feeling and released as much as she could to the Force. She loved Khan, and it seemed like he loved her too. They liked being around each other, and there was nothing wrong with that. Sometimes she wanted to have a bit of space to think, and there was nothing wrong with that either. Anya let her head drop on the edge of the tub and opened her eyes, meeting Khan's concerned gaze. She stayed silent, looking at him, thoughts swirling. What was he thinking about? Was he disappointed to see her so cold when they would be parting ways soon? Was she? A sharp pang seized her heart as regret spread in her veins. She was being an idiot. He was going back to Talervin in 2 days, and she was wasting the last hours they had to themselves by overthinking everything. He wanted to spend time with her. Of course, when he had felt her distress, he had came to check what was wrong. She would have ample time to dissect their holidays and analyze what had happened when she would be stuck in endless meetings at the Senate. There was no urgency to do it now. Come in, she told him, watching with a form of delight his uncertain face. There was something amusing about confusing him as he had confused her minutes ago. Khan stood awkwardly and removed his clothes, discarding them in a heap near hers before entering the water. She moved to give him some room and wrapped her arms around his shoulders, her entire being softening when she realized how stiff he was against her. I'm not mad at you, Anya whispered, carting her fingers through his hair in gentle motion she knew he liked. She felt him relax a bit and confessed, I'm afraid. He didn't turn to look at her, and she was grateful for it. Why? She stayed silent for a moment, pondering on the best way to speak her mind without spoiling the rest of their stay together, then sighed. It's new. Us. It's good, I don't regret it, but sometimes it makes me, she paused, looking for the right term, dizzy. Khan didn't reply at first, and she was starting to wonder if he would when he answered. I understand. He grabbed one of the bottles on the side of the tub. What do you use that for? It's not shampoo, is it? It's a conditioning mask, it strengthens the hair. Do you want to try? She replied, knowing he was still thinking about her words and needed some time to elaborate on his answer. He hummed approvingly, and she used the shower head to wet his hair before taking the bottle from his hand. He had no true need for the mask, lucky him, she thought as she massaged the product in. She smiled when she heard him let out a satisfied sigh. It felt nice, simple, soothing, too. It helped quiet her thoughts, releasing some of the tension that had plagued her since she had stepped in the refresher. When I met with Jared, the first time, he asked about my in-laws, he finally told her. I felt lightheaded for a moment. It's a lot. Her fingers stopped, eliciting an annoyed click of his tongue against his palate. What do you like about me? Anya asked, the question burning her lips with shame. Her nervousness had spiked when he had echoed her feelings that things were moving too fast, and with it, her previous anguish had resurfaced, rearing its ugly head. Maybe it was too much for him. Maybe he just wanted someone to sleep with. Maybe he wasn't ready for more. Maybe he hadn't really wanted to commit to her. She was the easy choice, after all, the only one who truly knew who he was and what he had been through. Was he with her because it was convenient? When he kissed her, was he regretting Pan? Khan shrugged, and she splashed him with the bathwater, eliciting an amused laugh. That wasn't supposed to be funny, she said testily, feeling something nasty rise in her chest. Hurt. Why was he deflecting, if her fears weren't true? I didn't know you expected a declaration, he drawled. A lot of things, does it have to be specific? Her heart warmed a bit at his words, and she shook her head before realizing that from his position with his back to her, he couldn't see it. No. Thank you. He turned to look at her, frowning. Why now? Either something in her expression or the feelings tainting their connection betrayed her, because his eyes narrowed nearly angrily. Don't. I'm sorry, she replied, guilt swarming her stomach at the pain she could read in his gaze. The bond was a double-edged sword sometimes, and if mentioning his dead wife in her political functions, usually it just made him highly uncomfortable. Evoking their past relationship even like this opened a box of deeply buried suffering that he clearly didn't want to touch. Khan sighed and settled back against her, spreading some of the hair mask on her chest. I'm not going to wake up tomorrow and decide I don't like you anymore. He paused, and she could feel some of the hurt searing hot through their connection. She was Anakin's wife, 25 years ago. I'm with you, now. Anya inhaled sharply, a strange mixture of sadness and joy swirling around them, and took his left hand in hers, lacing their fingers. It was the first time he had spoken so clearly about both relationships, and it was comforting in a way she hadn't expected, but it clearly took a toll on him, and she felt terrible that her insecurities had forced his hand. Her throat was too tight to speak properly, and she felt like nothing she could say could ever dim the pain, but eventually, he pressed her fingers in his, and something steadier blossomed between them. The end of winter break was coming soon and found Count Dooku relatively frustrated. Though the entire thing had been enjoyable, he was growing increasingly suspicious of his guest, and seemed to be no closer to pierce his mystery. He had to be the dark presence he had felt, there was no other culprit to be found, and time and experience had taught him that the simple solution was often the correct one. But how? The boy seemed quite taken with his niece, and apart from threatening Counselor Naremi with a touch of forced strangulation in a relatively tense situation, he had never seen him do anything remotely dark in nature. Yan parried the brown blade and attacked again. If he considered his own master, then he had to admit Darksiders were deceitful per nature, and that finding one was never as easy as one thought. Didn't he himself manage to keep up his charade in front of the GD? He had even been to their temple, and they had seen nothing. But then again, the GD didn't sleep under his roof nor fart with him every day. His own darkness was sometimes palpable, and politely ignored by both teenagers, and he had years of training. What was this boy, if he could hide such tremendous power and nearly never had a slip? The trip to Fiora turned you soft, Mr. Vader. Your blows lacked their usual panache, she taunted, even though he had to admit it wasn't really true. The flurry came, as expected, but no darkness. His back was sweaty, and his arm tired, but he kept going, escaping, blocking, returning each strike, increasing his speed in hope of a slip-up. Anya looked worried, from the bench she sat on, pretending to work on her datapad. Foolish girl. If the man she had chosen for herself was indeed a Darksider of the caliber he expected, she had no reasons to worry for him. And chosen she had, his presence during Sereno's official Life Day celebrations had proven her commitment to the relationship, as everyone had noticed. He had gotten countless comments when the delegation had arrived, more even when the young couple had eloped to Fiora for the new year. Who was that boy? Was he in it for the money? Where did she found him? How could he approve of an off-worlder? He eluded all questions, assuaging their fears and quelling their distrust, partly for Anya's sake, but mostly for himself. He could not have the boy under their constant scrutiny, not if he was going to uncover his truth. He needed him trustful, relaxed, and adequately riled up. Did Anya know? Was she aware that under that pleasant mask of the orphan student, brilliant and polite, something darker lurked? She had to be, they were too close, their bond too strong for her to have missed it, but after all could he blame her? When the time had come to flee with the traitors to Alderaan or remain loyal, she had chosen to remain with him, a Darksider even at that time. He had raised her, trained her, loved her. Was it so surprising that she hadn't been afraid to pick another Darksider as her partner? I sense your pride, and your uncertainty. Have I wounded your ego, Mr. Vader? There it was, under layers of careful discipline that could only come with rigorous training. Anger. The first spark, he could not let it die. He sped up harshly, grazing the boy's arm. Sloppy. Khan cast a look he couldn't place at Anya, and Dooku pinched his lips. He loved her, of that much he was sure. Their feelings rang true in the Force, blossoming each time they were together, strong enough to warm the very air around them when their eyes met. A love not unlike the kind Anya read so much about in her stories, young and powerful. Would it last? Genza's feelings for Azrael had never died, and as much as he had loathed the man, he would have destroyed entire planets to save his wife and daughter, if the need arose. Khan and Anya seemed to be taking that exact same path, together until death tore them apart and potentially disastrous for his own plans. If it was true, he needed to know who he was dealing with. He huffed haughtily. Weak. Was it just for show, Mr. Vader? I don't see much of a fighter today. He flung a bench at him, finally getting his attention back, and the anger grew hotter, for his greatest pleasure. The orphan from Tatooine, the GD from Talarvin, none of them should have been able to display this level of abilities. The boy was still holding back, and as much as it pained him to admit it, he would soon reach the apex of his abilities, if he didn't let the dark side in. Who was his master? Where had he learned to fight like this? His eyes were those of a warrior, his composure admirable under Dooku's pressure, his blows precise, his style original enough to keep him constantly on edge. It spoke of a lifetime of training when he knew he had at most a couple of years under the benevolent wing of the incompetent Shans. He wanted to use lightning, to gain the upper hand again, but Sith lightning could not be politely ignored, and it would draw Anya away from him. She was already mad, he could tell, staring at him in righteous anger as he annoyed her boyfriend to make him slip. Would she intervene? Would he let her? He had hurt Anya more than he had ever wanted to already, and the plans he was involved in would possibly hurt her even more. Was it cruel to seek out the truth of the one she loved? What would he do, if his suppositions were true? He could not tell his master. Sidious would either seek him out for himself or destroy him. Could he let him be? Could he stay silent, passive as Anya endangered herself with the boy? The attachment could drive him further down than he ever went if he were to slip, darkness consuming him, drowning him like it had been so close to drowning Dooku time and time again. Could he keep it at bay? Could Yan be sure his niece would be safe with the boy? Without circling, he threw the bench again, ready to parry another attack when he flew to the wall. He tried to break free, but the tendrils of power holding him were steady, and still not tainted by darkness. Power, pure power, and in a quantity he had never observed even in his own masters. Will you calm down, Count Dooku? Vader drawled from where he stood, looking both annoyed and slightly bored. Vexing really. His breathing was erratic, and he realized he himself had been using darkness, probably in his attempt to rile the boy up. He exhaled deeply, reining it in, and Khan released him from his hold. He had been gentle, for he felt unharmed outside of his exertion. Surprising, but at this point, not even unexpected. Anya rose from her bench and put her hand on the boy's shoulder. Khan relaxed minutely, his eyes still trained on him as Dooku walked up to the couple, extinguished saber in hand. You did not break. Impressive. He raised an impertinent brow. You certainly have a talent for antagonizing your opponents. Why now? Dooku attached the saber back to his belt, noting distractedly that Vader was wearing his gift, and let out a small sigh. He could pretend this was all for training purposes, and give up any chance of getting the answers he wanted by the end of the break, or he could distill at least some of the truth, and hope to get the truth in return. It was a presence I felt shortly after your arrival, something dark. Anya tense, her fingers clenching on Vader's shoulder, and he knew he had scored. It was him. Vader was the one he had felt leaking such an oppressive power. The boy looked at her, assessing something, and he had once more the impression they spoke without words, having their own private little chat from the comfort of their own mind. Will you tell? The mechanical voice was back, strong and monotone. There was a threat there, a promise too. If he talked, Vader would find a way to shut his mouth, potentially forever. He looked at Anya, curious of her stance, but her face was neutral. They were in agreement, and she would support the boy in his endeavor. Either she didn't think the boy would do anything crazy, or she knew he would, and she still chose him over Dooku. This was a truth he would not seek out. No, he finally replied, watching her relax slightly. She still trusted him, she trusted his words, his honesty. His heart clenched in his chest, and he started to feel a bit ashamed of his distasteful behavior. Vader's jaw clenched, looking not overly aggressive but clearly frustrated by his behavior. Then why would you try so hard to push me to reveal myself? I needed to know the extent of it, and how easy it was to coax it out. Attachments. Anya interrupted him. Attachments are dangerous for people like us. Vader looked thoughtful, and his niece somewhat moved by his statement. She felt his intent, curiosity, and protectiveness battling for the truth, and though she obviously didn't care at all for the potential danger of her predicament, she seemed to like that he did. They shared a look, something that was quickly becoming annoying, and Vader crossed his arms on his chest, scowling. I'm not going to hurt Anya. You slept at least twice in a single week, surely you understand how hard it is to believe you, Dooku retorted sharply. He didn't want a one-up Sith with abysmal control to be so close to Anya. They were the worst, the most unstable. He couldn't lose her too. Vader let out a small sigh. What you felt wasn't me falling to the dark side, just a leak through my shields. Show me. Anya let go of the boy's shoulder to grab his hand in support, apparently not particularly afraid, and Vader unlocked his arms, keeping her hand in his. He looked at him with a closed face, his severe features seemingly carved from the hardest stone, his eyes shining unnaturally under the training room light. Then, he felt it. It was like being plunged in white hot water, so searing it seemed cold. He could not breathe, he could not think, there was only power, raw and pure, beaming out of the boy visibly, making the furniture tremble as his very cells quivered in terror. The beast he had glimpsed had unfurled, no longer asleep, and a roar echoed in his ears as the pressure in the room drastically increased, weakening his knees and making his stomach flip. Now that he was in front of the phenomenon, and observing it closely, it felt like pure icy darkness, untainted by any obvious feeling and balanced with scorching light. The dragon's sword, permeating the air with its very presence, heavy and ominous, and Dooku was 10 seconds away from kneeling when it all disappeared. Vader's eyes were glinting with a tinge of gold, but outside from that he looked perfectly unfazed, and Anya's calm face showed that she was somewhat indifferent to the display. The experience left Dooku exhausted. It was like he had just been plunged into the burning core of a planet, then dumped in the icy frost of space. His bones felt brittle, and he still couldn't breathe normally. Would even Sidious be enough to tame such a power? No. He would not, and wasn't that thought scary? How good was his control? How deep went his power if this was just a display of his natural force presence? He was startled from his thoughts by Anya, who wrapped her arms around him and held him for a moment. She felt fresh, light, and somewhat flowery against him. He relaxed, soothed by her presence, and leaned in her embrace. These moments were rare, as he wasn't keen on being touched, and he would have usually never agreed to it in front of a stranger. Though could Vader still be considered a stranger after he shared his secret? He wasn't, not anymore. If Anya wanted him, then he was family. Not that he had a great history with family anyway, but he felt a kinship with the boy, a familiarity that he had only known with other Force sensitives. Anya, Qui-Gon, Sifo, and maybe Khan. A new bond to treasure, another one Sidious, would eventually try to have him sever. "Don't betray us," she pleaded, whispering against his ear, and it rang like a threat. He shut his eyes, knowing he had a choice in front of him, and closed his arms around her. "I won't." The Force sang, sealing the truth, and Dooku prayed silently, hoping his master would never take an interest in the young couple.